Is 100% digital good for guests? Are 80% of loyalty programs broken? And what's on the minds of restaurant owners over in Europe? That's all ahead on this week's Digital Restaurant. The digital restaurant works like this. We're going to ask each other 5 questions about headlines that affect the worlds of restaurants, off-premise, and technology, but in some way tie back to our book series, Delivering the Digital Restaurant. Are you ready? Let's go. Happy Monday, Meredith. How are you doing today?
I'm very good. How are you, Carl?
I'm okay, thank you. Do you have a nice weekend?
I did indeed.
Excellent. What did you get up to?
Cookbook lunch party.
Oh, really? What is a cookbook launch party? I think you're going to have to put some photos out of that. That
I
sounds
will.
like one that we're all going to want to hear about. So I
I
look
will.
forward to
Yeah.
seeing your social feed.
All right, Carl. Very interesting week this week with a lot of debates, I would say. A lot of debates happening. And the very first one is a case for the 100% digital restaurant, which, of course, we're probably a little biased here, but it feels like people are coming around.
Yeah, you're right. This one isn't so much of a news story. An opinion piece, I think, is what they call it in the journalist world. And Joe Koskowski wrote a great column about this one where he's saying that a lot of restaurants now are starting to target 100% digital transactions. And he was questioning, is this going to be good for the consumer or not? And of course, we know that Wingstop have talked about this, Firehouse Subs, some of the largest QSR brands out there share the aspiration of 100% digital. I think Patrick Doyle was quoted in the article, who's the chairman of Firehouse. And he said, all we've got to do is rip out the front counter order points and replace it with kiosks. And by 2025, we'll be 100% digital. So I guess he's right. You know, the point here, though, isn't that digital isn't about delivery anymore. And I think really it's about customer data and the fact that if you can get more customer data and have it in a more plentiful fashion, you're going to get better insights about your customers. Now, Joe points out the value comes, of course, from digitization around reducing labor costs, how kiosks have higher check averages, and he definitely leans in heavily on the data perspective as well. But here's a theoretical question I've got and I'd love to hear what our restaurant operator friends think of this one. And that is, how much value do you place on knowing your customer's email address or cell phone number? And I guess the follow up question to that would be, how much would you invest or pay to get that data? Because that answer may derive how much you should then invest into converting customers, getting more marketing attributed to encourage a guest to provide it, right? And so for me, we're seeing this drive towards guests wanting a more digital experience. We know that's definitely a theme. We know restaurants have an eagerness to be able to get more data. And we know that digital provides more ease and convenience. And Joe quotes Noah Glass of Olo saying that digital orders also are proven to result in higher conversion and higher frequency. So Joe then says, well, is 100% digital the right direction? He quotes the National Restaurant Association's report that we talked about a few episodes ago, asking the question of limited service restaurants, where the split between customers preferring ordering via a person versus a phone or a kiosk was actually a little bit more even. And so therefore he finishes his piece by saying, maybe 90% is more realistic. I think that's where I end up disagreeing. Because building a fully digital restaurant from the ground up would be far easier than having to mesh together a mixture of different channels, right? Traditional channels and digital.
You
And
mean like what restaurants are trying to do right now?
which is exactly where they are
Yeah.
today. And we know how much complexity that the growth of
So
delivery has
hard.
forced upon them, right? So
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. And it's built upon an operational model and a design that was built to satisfy those specific channels. And so when in this era now of omni-channel fulfillment, and so therefore, if what we're talking about is about digital engagement on-premise as well, I think we're going to get to a place where we need to ask ourselves, do we need to change the operating model entirely? I mean, we're going to probably get to a point, if regulations change, where we'll end up with 100% cashless in restaurants as well, right? Well, of course, we can't assume that everyone's going to pick up an app or work a kiosk in the same way as the more digitally forward youngsters amongst us. But we have to build a case, I think, with that ease of use in mind and create models of support that help. The biggest challenge for me with 100% digital is if we let the efficiencies that it offers impact the hospitality and the experiences that our guests can enjoy. And so my hope is that it opens up the chance for more human experiences and empowers our team members to to use the data to have more personalized, enjoyable experiences. So I don't know. I guess my top tip for restaurant owners to think about as a result of this particular one is consider how much value you could derive from communicating to your customers, every single one of them, and what impact to sales would that make to your business if you were able to do so? What do you think?
I agree. I would add to that, how much easier would your life be if you had one system with all the data in one place and you weren't trying to stitch all this stuff together? That is a strong case for 100% digital. But here's where I do agree with Joe. I don't know that it's 90% digital at every single restaurant. I think it's probably a barbell where some restaurants will be 100% and some restaurants will be like 20%. And
Totally.
then on average, they'll be at 90, which I know we'll talk about a little later on another question. But yeah, I think he's right. I think that's where we're headed. The more that really advanced digital restaurants can show consumers what they get as a result of digitization that's better, and what can I do with technology that I couldn't do with a human, the more this whole thing will just snowball and take off. Exactly like we've seen in other channels, right? You wouldn't dream of calling a hotel to book a hotel room.
Oh my
What?
goodness, it's so true. You're right. When was the last time I called a hotel? Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's move on. Let's talk about another theme here. Data optimization was the theme of this next article, but it also ties in quite closely to some interesting things that have been happening in Florida. Care to tell us more?
First of all, this article that Joanna Fantozzi put out on Nation's Restaurant News, the punchline of it is sort of like, okay, now we're starting to have data, but we're not exactly sure how to use it. Really interesting in that nobody feels confident about their data. And the folks that do, there's a few digital leaders who do, they're investing a ton of resources in making it happen. The other thing that I think is probably most fascinating here is if you go all the way down to which categories of customer data does your location or organization collect and share, 16% of them say, I collect customer data shared by third-party delivery aggregators. I just want to remind all the independent restaurants out there who are listening that you do not get the same treatment from DoorDash and Uber that everyone else gets, the big guys. Those big guys are getting totally different deals than you are because they have big brands and they're bringing consumers with them to the platforms because of those big brands and all their marketing spend. So when you are super frustrated by the third parties, remember they treat you differently. That explains why it is that the third parties have been embraced so much by the big brands. You'll remember the story I told last time about going onto the McDonald's website and clicking order now, and it gave me like 5 different ways to order, only one of which was their own website. They were not prioritizing it in any way. And that's because they don't care. They don't care. They've made the margins even across and they are getting the data across. And so they don't care. You do whatever you want. You do you, consumer. The way that this ties to the Florida story, Florida just passed a bill that said that restaurants will be able to communicate with the consumer for 2 hours post food going out the door.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The intent of this bill is to try to make it easier for consumers and restaurants to resolve whatever issues they might have because it is terribly confusing in a third party situation. Who is responsible? Is it the delivery platform? Is it the restaurant? Is it the driver? I'm not sure. What should I do when something inevitably goes wrong, as it probably will when there are that many handoffs? And so the state of Florida is requiring that the third party platforms make restaurants able to talk directly with consumers. Now, I think this is a big win for consumers because it does make things more clear. I'm not sure. What do you think? Is it a bigger win for a restaurant or actually for the third parties? Because I can see reasons why both would want this.
There's a couple of things. One, I wonder whether it's going to help in terms of chargeback costs, right? Because now if the restaurant's more involved in resolving an issue, they've got a much better case to be able to fight any chargeback costs. On the other side of it, the marketplaces are also going to be saving money on setting up these big customer success teams that are dealing with those issues through chatbots and the rest of
Totally.
it. So
Totally.
is a restaurant really going to be on hand to have someone available to resolve the issues? Look, ultimately, we're getting to a situation where we have to still come back to the fact that if you can get the order right at the moment it's picked up, so that you're not having any issues
Yeah.
as often as you
Yes.
possibly can avoid, at least, then that's the best outcome. But look, I'm not averse to seeing how it works out. I'd be intrigued to see how it works out. I think there's going to be a lot of restaurants that aren't even in Florida that are going to look at this and say, would this work for us?
I think it's interesting that the government had to even get involved. If I were a third party, I would much rather have questions and complaints go to the restaurant than come to me. much rather. And if I were a restaurant, frankly, same thing. I would rather be able to talk to my consumer directly. And if they've got some kind of challenge, help resolve that challenge. The most loyal customers are the ones you win back when you correct a problem. I think it's very interesting that the government had to make this rule and it wasn't a natural result of market forces and demands, but I'm very excited to see how it goes. Interestingly, though, although they get to talk to the consumer for 2 hours, they don't get their data. So the Florida law falls short of saying you can talk to them forever, right? They just said 2 hours. You guys can go back and forth messaging via the app. So Florida's not leveling the playing field between the big guys and the independent restaurants. Surprised by that.
I'm sure there'll be a technology solution that someone dreams up.
Yes, there will probably be another random piece of SaaS that you need as a restaurant to pay a monthly fee for in order to somehow intervene and capture that data and
Yeah.
try to do something with it, and then stitch it together with all the rest of your data. Going back to where we started.
All right.
Yeah, goodness. It is much easier to just have all the data in one place from the get-go than to try to stitch it all together.
And is that your top tip?
Yeah, yes, that is my top tip. And you know what that leads to? Our last question.
Hi, Carl here. Just to interrupt the show briefly to remind you that if you have yet to get your copy of either of the Delivering the Digital Restaurant books, now is the time to get one. If you head to thedigital.restaurant, you're going to be able to get the best price available. You can also listen to both books with yours truly talking about them on Audible. You can get a copy off Amazon if you'd prefer to order through them. But if you haven't got the books yet, get them. They really are going to transform the way in which you look at the restaurant industry and the way in which technology is disrupting it.
All right, Q State of the Industry report just came out where they talk about what's going on in digital. They've done this 5 years running, which I always love because then you can see trends over time. But the big story that came out here was that loyalty seems to be broken in the restaurant industry. What do you make of this?
Well, this is one that I have to bring up on screen for sure, Meredith. So I'll shrink us and bring this up here because you're right. First of all, before I talk about loyalty, thank you to Jen Kern. She gave us a sneak peek of this a few weeks back, and it's a pretty substantial study. I think it's fair to say 62,000 enterprise QSR fast casual locations represented, 180 brands. And the majority actually aren't Q customers. So that's kind of refreshing to hear. Usually we get these studies from companies that are supporting the industry, and a lot of them are talking about the virtues of the particular platform they're working with. So great to be able to see this from Q. So let's move through these because there's a few topics. Loyalty is definitely the big one. But first of all, let's go to this here about digital sales. The good news is that digital sales are on the rise, as you can see. Now, the majority of those respondents actually said about 42% have digital sales in the range of 26 to 50% right now. And no surprise, perhaps, to see that actually it's in the fast casual category where you're seeing a much larger proportion than what you're seeing in QSRs, with 50% in the 26 to 50% and 43% for QSRs in the 11 to 25% range. So, as we move on deeper into this, it then talks about the fact that people continue to see that level of increase happening. And then the one we talked about in our New Year predictions, kiosks. They say make a comeback, I think they've been on the rise for quite a while. But in terms of new ordering channels, nearly 50% of folks are saying that is what they're adding in to their business this year. Look further on this list here, Meredith, where you'll see 25% to mobile app, expanded delivery partners, and then phone AI and voice ordering also represented here as well. Now, got to get onto loyalty because that's the big one. You're right. 80% of respondents say loyalty is not working for their brand. 80%. Now, big caveat here. When I dug into this and asked Jen about the perspective of who was answering the questions, about 50% of those that responded were CTOs. About 15% were CMOs, 15% COOs. So there's certainly a technology oriented bias to some of the perspectives here. But nevertheless, there's a number of angles I think we could perceive this. One, of course, is that the loyalty programs that worked maybe 10 years or so ago are not the right fit today. But if I answer this more from the CTO perspective, I wonder whether it's more about data and the way in which data, again, is flowing through. And albeit that loyalty programs do indeed get you closer to understanding your customer, if you can't use it in an effective way, then clearly you're not going to be able to harness the true benefits of your loyalty platform. So no surprise then to see Where folks are focusing their attention in terms of investment, 46% are focusing their attention to loyalty. Menu boards are up here. POS, of course, kiosks, as you can see, represented.
Say that again. Loyalty is broken, but my top investment is loyalty. Tell me
Yeah,
about it.
well, exactly. I mean, that's basically saying they're having to change it up. They're having to change it up because they're saying it's not working today.
So they believe it can work. They just don't think it's working today.
Yeah, I think it's basically reflecting on the current loyalty programs, right? And a lot of these brands will have had loyalty programs in place for many years, and transitioning from one to another isn't an easy exercise. But I can see why they're now saying, well, actually, if we can turn to having more digital transactions, which of course is beyond just off premise, and start to entertain this through kiosk orders as well, then that data richness that we've been talking about already today is something that's going to enable them to be able to create a much better guest experience. So, moving on from that, let's go a little deeper into the report. I'm not going to cover everything here, but you'll also see this one, which I don't know how many times we have to keep talking about it, but 64% said order accuracy is mediocre or weak. I mean, that's crazy, isn't it? When you look at that, they're
Why is
saying
that not the top investment area? That is just unacceptable.
it's terrible. And 57% of what they're saying is the problem is training. How many more times do we need to talk about training and helping employees understand this? Now, you could argue it's again associated to the operating model, the fact that you've got all these channels operating in a business and an operating model that was developed and shaped not to be able to accommodate this high level of volume coming through off premise channels. And of course, 16% of the issues they're saying are coming as a result of driver and customer pickup issues. But look, training accuracy, my goodness, this is an ongoing issue that seems to rear up every time we look at these different studies. Any thoughts yourself on this particular study here, Meredith? Anything caught your eye?
Thank you to Q for putting this together. I love the perspectives of all the restaurants summarized in one place. That loyalty point is very interesting to me. I think, again, if we go back to the 100% digital transactions, if you know who everybody is and they're all in the same piece of software, regardless of which channel they came from, why do you need a loyalty program? Do you? I don't know. You might not.
Well, one thing I do think you need, my big tip from this one, is if you are a fast casual or QSR brand out there and you're sitting on the fence about embracing kiosks, and there's still obviously a chunk out there that are not using the kiosk at the moment, I think this is an obvious trend to be part of. Every time I see data about them, it's certainly helping with check averages, helps with time, helps with labor. There's a lot of benefits. So I'm sure that if you're not looking at it, you should be. Okay, next question. It's almost an old article, I think it's fair to say, because we know Wendy's have indeed been in the news over the last few weeks. But I thought we should approach this from a slightly different perspective. And that is when tech is being introduced to the industry or to the consumer base, how should execs think about treating it? What's your take on this one?
Wendy's really went through the ringer in the last 2 weeks. They came out with a message around dynamic pricing, and the press just had a field day calling it surge pricing, and the internet blew up. So consumers were understandably upset with the idea that what they perceived to be Wendy's saying, if we're really busy, we're going to gouge you, right? I think is what people took from the way that it was called surge pricing. And I think we all remember the early days of Uber when you would get crazy quotes for rides during a rainstorm. And everyone felt that was terribly unfair. Now, prices still go up during a rainstorm. And this is one of the advantages of pricing, right? A price is a signal in a market when supply and demand are imbalanced that help bring them back into balance. So it's a very helpful little thing. In general, I think it can help restaurants push volume to where they need it. And restaurants have been doing this forever. I know you've said many times things like blue plate specials and LTOs and happy hours. All of these things are, in a way, dynamic pricing, using, in those cases, a lower price to push consumers to a time when maybe the restaurant's not as busy. Restaurants also do it for holidays. Think of having to pay in advance to do a prefix menu on New Year's Eve at a restaurant that you normally would never have to do that at. Everyone wants to go out, and therefore the price is higher. So the idea of changing price based on supply and demand is not new in restaurants. And in fact, as it relates to specifically delivery, of course, I think you pointed out before, DoorDash has been doing it for a long time. They'll say on a Friday night at 6 o'clock when you order, hey, you want to wait 2 hours and get $2 off? And for some people, that's totally fine. They're not super hungry and they don't need to eat right away. And yeah, I'll wait till there's more drivers available and it's not crazy busy. That's fine. But As much as all of this makes sense, I think your question is the right one. When you introduce a new concept, particularly a new type of tech to consumers, you got to tell them what's in it for them. And that has to be the primary message. And let's go back to our kiosk example. We were just talking about kiosks, how great they are, how they increase check, they increase frequency, they reduce labor costs. All those things are great benefits for the restaurant. What's the benefit for the consumer? Well, they can take longer thinking about what they want without feeling like they're tying up somebody's time. They can explore the menu. They can do some upsells and add-ons that maybe they would feel awkward telling another person that I want double chicken, but I feel fine telling a computer that I want double chicken. That's okay. There's all kinds of benefits in terms of frictionlessness, ease of ordering. For our younger consumers out there, you don't have to talk to anyone. As restaurants roll these things out, they really need to be mindful that, yes, there's a lot of benefits for them, but there's a lot of benefits for the consumer too. And in the case of dynamic pricing, I think there are tons of benefits for the consumer to be able to get a better deal when things are slow, to be able to pay more, to prioritize my order when things are busy. These are great consumer benefits. All right, my European friend, can you tell us about what's going on in European restaurants? They came out with a state of the industry report. They being who? Tell us about
Apic Base, our friends over at Apic Base, which help restaurants with optimizing their ingredients, saving on food costs, things like that. So a technology platform. Most of their customers are over in Europe, as you say. Now, Meredith, this was a 73-page state of the industry report. So I'm going to go through every single slide. No, I'm
it. Oh
not.
my God.
I'm going to bring up I'm going to bring up six, if I may, six different ones as things that I picked out from the report. The first one here is from a very wonderfully named Carl Henrik Forsbeck. Forsbeck, I think you say his name. He's the CEO of Balls and Ruth. I think that's how you'd pronounce his restaurant. But what's interesting for me is talking again about this theme, which has been central to today's podcast, and that is data. And what he's saying is consumer patterns have changed. It's much harder to predict when customers decide to eat at our restaurants. Out of nowhere, a random Tuesday can have high revenue while the following Thursday is much below average. I think that's a really interesting point, right? We sometimes forget that these moments of not surge pricing, but surge orders can happen. And that is also a function of being able to understand how and where you're advertising and making sure that you are indeed in a place where you can make sure you've got the necessary resources in place in terms of your workforce and ingredients to be able to accommodate those challenges. But this is the challenge of being in an omni-channel environment. The next one here, this is a CFO perspective. Mads Benson, who's the CFO at Oli Oli, and he's talking about the shift in what we've seen in the capital markets. He said the capital markets have increasingly shifted their focus from CAGR to EBITDA margins. And the question is, how do we position ourselves to that shift to successfully maintain the growth that we want? And the text really to the right there is just emphasizing the fact that now that we're in a slightly more difficult capital environment, actually we're having to turn our attention to profitability. Now, I don't know, you're more the financier than me, but it's an interesting one for me, this, because I would have thought profitability should be a central focus all of the time. But clearly, this is something which we've seen in the restaurant technology space. How can we get the best models coming through to support restaurants? The ones that have got a good case to be able to make are the ones that are certainly seeing more investment and certainly seeing more chances of surviving through a capitally tight environment. But it seems like it's applying also to restaurants here as well. Any thoughts on that one?
Certainly, as interest rates go up, there is more focus on profitability. The unit level focus on profitability should have always been there.
Yeah.
And for any brand for which it wasn't, that is an unusual state of affairs. There was a time when everyone thought above restaurant, where that G&A is, you need to spend what you need to spend to do the things you need to do in marketing and technology in particular. And as you add stores, you will grow into paying for that corporate level EBITDA.
Right.
That's really where the change has come, is that now folks are looking at those entities, not just at the unit level and saying, great, you make money at the unit level, but how can you make money at the corporate level too? And I think this will turn into a very interesting thing for technology, because at some point, all of these restaurants who have been trying to build their own custom tech stacks and are employing a fleet of people trying to figure all this stuff out, they'll say, ooh, I don't know if it makes sense for us to have so many people above restaurant trying to figure out all this technology stuff and so many different types of technology that we're paying for. Maybe we need to have the technology that our store count can afford, whether that's 10, 20, 50, 80 stores. And that might mean buying more off the shelf things, buying more holistic technology rather than trying to stitch together a bunch of pieces. I think that is definitely something that will come out of this.
I think that's fascinating. And you've always said about the idea of the magic 100 in terms of once you get to 100 units, that's when you start to see those kind of returns coming through a little bit better. I wonder whether that number will reduce it in time with technology efficiencies that come through. Any thoughts on that? Do you think that we might get to a point where 50 might be the magic number because of technology?
I do. That's a fascinating question. The 100 number is based on a typical AUV. And the real thing that changes that is if your AUV is much, much higher, then your unit level cash flow is going to be much, much higher. The more cash you're generating per unit, the fewer units you need to make the whole thing make sense. The way that technology will inform that for the most part is going to be around figuring out how to drive up the average unit volume of a restaurant. And we already see this in some of the newer concepts, either having multiple brands under one roof, or even like in the case of Chick-fil-A, super high volumes, just doing one thing really, really well over and over and over again, but having lots of different channels that they do it through, right? They're doing tons
Mm.
of catering, tons of online sales, lots of different ways that they're going to market in addition to the drive-through. So I think that's one way that technology will absolutely change that number. And then the other question is, can technology actually reduce the above unit cost required to run a chain?
Interesting. Well, that's actually a little bit of a segue into this next
Mhm.
one, which I thought was
Yeah.
interesting. Central production units. I guess for some of us, we might call that hub and spoke in a way. But the idea here that Jeremy Dean, who's the operations manager at a German vegan donut shop, says the economies of scale and simplified logistics are most important to us. Simplified logistics. When would you hear a restaurant operations manager talk about that, right? With our centralized kitchen, we can order ingredients in larger quantities at better prices and have them all delivered to one location. That one sounds really interesting to me because that seems to be a theme that we're starting to see in some of these emerging models that are coming through. And of course, if you can, as they say here, streamline back of house operations and improve product consistency, you're going to be able to give restaurant managers more time to focus on that guest experience, which of course is what we all want. And so, if you are developing a restaurant network in a particular area, thinking about that idea of having a central commissary in a place and being able to distribute from it is certainly something that the folks over in Germany here are looking at.
It's kind of like Pret, right? Or Prepper Foods. They very much have a similar model. And the big chains here in the US, they do, in a way, have centralized commissaries. They just have giant, giant manufacturing plants that are putting a lot of the stuff together for them. And they're doing a lot of reheat and assembly at the actual kitchen level. What's happening here is the consumer's changing and they want things that are more freshly prepared and they want access to these newer flavors. A vegan bagel, come on, that's a new trend. And those newer trends, those newer consumers, they can't get to the scale of a 10,000 unit QSR chain overnight. So how do you get the best of the scale with the best of the freshness? It's probably these, it's almost like a little edge factory.
That's right. Yeah, exactly it. The other thing here, which I thought was interesting, and this is leaning more into the technology piece, is what Peter Schimpel here, who's the VP of Digital IT at Losteria, he was saying instead of forcing new technology on traditional processes, we're rethinking our internal workflows to align with technology, not the other way around. Now, there's an image also in the deck, which I haven't got here to show you, but it basically positions technology in the middle of the entire operating model. And of course, as we said right at the top, right, as we've been trying to force fit technology on top of current operations, if you are starting a new restaurant today, if you start with technology in the middle of that, you can build your operational workflows around it, which I think is what Peter is referring to here.
That's so true. There's so many things that because we were doing them with our finite human brains previously, there was only so much that we could do. And so that caused us to say, well, the operations need to work like this in a very simple way because of our finite human brains. But once you access the infinite brain of a computer, those limitations go away. So if you design, as he's saying, around the infinite brain of a computer and what it's capable of, you get a very different operational answer than if you say, you know what, it is way too hard for a human to remember a menu that has 300 things on it and 800 different ingredients and five different cooking processes and infinite number of cook times. A human can't do that, but a
Yeah,
computer can.
yeah. Exactly. Otherwise, a lot of the themes within the deck represented what we've seen here in the US, right? So the compound annual growth rate is about 9.5% in Europe. It's about 10.5, 11%, I think, in the US, are slightly behind, but things are moving in the right direction. But there's also the concern associated to ongoing inflation, albeit somewhat less than where it was a couple of years ago. So not many macro shifts, I don't think, from that perspective. But here was an interesting one, because you and I were having a conversation offline before we started recording about some of the differences of the US versus Europe. And if you look at this chart here, I was curious for your reaction to it, because obviously QSRs are a dominant form of restaurant category here in the US, where you could use the word convenience to basically summarize what they represent. But you'll also see in Europe, I think, the experiential restaurants, the smaller chains or even independents themselves, certainly focus very much more on the experience. And the deck suggested, look, what consumers are after now isn't an either or. They want to be able to get 50% convenience, 50% experience, which I think is exactly what we're seeing here in the US as well, albeit it's not moving from experience to convenience, it's going from convenience to experience. But in Europe, it's the other way around a little bit. So it's interesting how these things are almost converging with the consumer driving the attention to say, I want it all.
Well, they want it all, but I don't know that they want it all from the same place, and that's what I take from this chart is that the Michelin star restaurant is never gonna be super convenient, and a QSR is never gonna be super amazing experience. They're just different things, and so the consumer might want both those things, but they want them at different times in different places from different restaurants. And it feels very much like the industry is pulling to these two extremes. Whereas before, for the last 30 years, it felt like we were trying to average those two extremes. You think about casual dining, they were bringing the best of a sit down restaurant with servers and all those things, but they were making it more convenient. It was a little bit cheaper, it was a little bit faster, it was a little bit more consistent. And it was bringing those things together. Now it feels like we're in an era where we're pulling those things apart.
Thank you to Epic Base for being able to share that with us. Always interesting to get perspectives from other places other than here in the US. And I would also be very keen to hear any of you over there in Europe for your take on that there. But look, we have gone on a while. This is probably our longest episode yet of one of our little news run throughs. But thank you for bearing with us if you're still there. But as ever, thank you for joining us. Leave us your questions, your comments, and we'll see you next time. The Digital Restaurant Podcast is available for you to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Watch us, rate us, and subscribe to The Digital Restaurant on YouTube, and follow along on all our social media digital restaurant channels. Thanks for listening.